We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anadromist. I'm Burn Power, and I'm coming to you from a pretty hot day in Tbilisi, Georgia. And I'm inside. Turn the air conditioner off. Fortunately, we have cheap electricity here. Keeps this Alaskan body from suffering unduly during the broiling summers. But you may have noticed that it's taken a while to get my next video up. A few people have commented on this, and there's been a reason, and that is I was inspired by an idea, and then it turned out to be really complicated, and that's how it goes. By the way, if you hear any loud banging or machinery or anything, they're doing some serious construction in my neighborhood, but chances are you won't hear it. But just in case, now you know. So, what's the idea? Well, about a month or so ago, a little longer than a month maybe, during the height of the pandemic season for me, not the height of the pandemic season for many of you, I was talking with Paul Vanderklay. We did a live discussion, and it was kind of interesting. For one reason or another, I got to talking about how much of what we see around us now in our culture has the aspects of a cargo cult. And we talked about that a little bit, but it seemed to generate some sort of thing. Paul suddenly was like, oh, but a few other people kind of latched onto it, but I realized, oh, well, I know a lot more about cargo cults. Also, I've heard it said quite a few times that there is a cultish aspect to what's been going on, especially in the wake of the protests and rioting and the cultural revolution that's been occurring since the end of May, since the period after the George Floyd protests. And yet, unlike most cults, there is no specific leader. That is to say, we're not like seeing a revival of the 70s, where you had people like Werner Erhard with his EST, Erhard Seminar Trainings, which was definitely like a cult which got inside of your mind. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of Scientology that are like that, and you have a top-down structure. But Jordan Peterson discussed something, and it was the concept of ideological possession. It's a concept he borrowed from Carl Gustav Jung, the philosopher and psychologist, and it's that people today are, in a sense, possessed by these pseudo-religions of our societies. Although my feeling is at some point here we've gone from them being pseudo-religions to being real religions, and that's what I want to discuss today. Now, the traditional dangerous cult essentially has certain aspects to it. One of those aspects is that there is usually a leader, a charismatic leader often. Think Charles Manson, think Jim Jones. It is very obviously hierarchical. Also, there are books, a literature, something that one has to follow, a very strict sense of discipline. But the cult-like activity today that we are seeing is very postmodern. It takes on a different form. And, or rather we could say it's beginning to show one of the aspects of what lies beyond postmodernity. Postmodernism is often said to question the validity of meta-narratives. In other words, that any sort of story-like structure which explains everything to the world. And since in this view everything can be reinterpreted or deconstructed, nothing is seen as solid, no interpretation. No government, no institution, no corporation, no facts ultimately can be seen as stable, even as we'll see scientific facts suddenly start to seem really wobbly under these new postmodern skepticisms of any sort of mega narratives, but meta narratives as well. So any remaining cultural institutions that claim any authority are seen as being repositories of error. Evil would probably be too strong a word, although I think for some people, any semblance of traditional family structure, traditional church structure, traditional school structure is seen as evil. I mean, it's really strange. And it's moving quickly. So, the cults we have seen in the past, particularly those that kind of come to mind from the 70s and around that time period, all the way up to the science fiction cult Heaven's Gate, are more modernist cults. Although Heaven's Gate is kind of a bridge cult because everyone was into UFOs. And but there was one strong leader and a very hermetic view of the world. But those kind of cults aren't as big a danger at the moment. They may return. But that doesn't mean there are no more cults. Something has changed. The mode of what it constitutes a cult has started to change. And has, started is probably too weak. It's fully changed. Now, as I was considering how they have been changed, I suddenly realized that I already knew the answer. And, of course, the answer is they have started to imitate the form of cargo cults. And I saw that this came from an area of the world that I've had a long-standing symbolic interest in, and that is New Guinea and Melanesia. And my fascination with New Guinea and Melanesia stems from a couple of sources, but one in particular. When I was young, for about 4 years as a child, I lived in Honolulu, Hawaii with my mother. And of course, I had been born in Seattle, Washington. And as I moved to Honolulu, it was a period when there was a lot of Hawaiian imagery that had been seeping into the general culture. This was the period of Martin Denny. It was the period of Alfred Apaka and eventually people like Don Ho. It was the period of, luau's and Hawaiian shirts and such. I arrived in 1959 and was basically brought into this tropical world. I remember, pulling frogs out of the fallen banana trees, and they were just frogs burrowed inside of banana trees. Very strange experience. But I remember all these kind of tropical experiences. So the idea of the tropics and stuff had entered my mind. Around, I think it was 1961, 1962, a film was released that was making actually the drive-in circuit of all places. It was a documentary about Papua New Guinea called The Sky Above, the Mud Below. And this was actually, it turns out, as I researched later, a French expedition into one of the last uncontacted places on Earth, the last blank spots on the map. Now, as a kid, this was just absolutely fascinating to me. And here's why it had such resonance for me. This is one of the first films I ever saw. In 1959, as a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, there wasn't much on television. You didn't see that much on television. Television was super primitive then. So you didn't see a lot of movies on TV. I didn't grow up watching movies all the time. I don't remember much about television until I'm about 5 or 6. But then I was actually thinking this the other day. What are the first movies I remember seeing? And I think how interesting it is that I can remember the first movies I ever saw. Because I think most people today have seen so many films by the time they are a very young child that they can't remember any of those films, where I can remember almost everyone, because everyone was a theatrical experience. And some of them, like The Sky Above, The Mud Below, I can even remember we arrived late in the film at a drive-in movie theater, and I can remember exactly the point in the film at which we arrived. They were doing this ceremony with a lot of strange grass on top of themselves, and they were pretending to give birth. It was just a very strange moment. And we stayed and watched it until it came up again, that point. Years later, I eventually found a video and then a DVD of it, although there's kind of an English narration to it, which is a little too prissy. I really would like to see it in the original French, which I never have, with subtitles, because I think it would give it a very different sense of interpretation. But anyway, that film won the Academy Award for Best Documentary. Almost impossible to imagine such a film like this winning a documentary today, that award. Because, of course, it would be seen completely as politically incorrect. Whereas the more I look at it now, what it did to me is it said, like, oh my goodness, there really were natives in canoes who are like chanting. And it was like, whoa, this is, to use the cliched phrase, other. This wasn't your politically correct, humanities professor using the word other. This was like something completely outside of the realm of anything that anyone knew. And the truth is, this sort of thing no longer exists. It was a record of a last moment. You could almost get an idea of what, Captain Cook might have encountered as he was passing through these islands. And, it was the sense of, what the African explorers might have, or the Amazonian explorers might have encountered. Just these people who lived as, well, they used the word savages, but really they were wild. They were, anyway, it just got into me. Later, I became interested in another phenomenon, the cargo cult. And cargo cults were also located in New Guinea and in the islands, particularly the Solomon Island chain nearby, in places like Vanuatu and the New Hebrides, and places like this, all in what's called Melanesia. And they're all connected culturally in a strange sort of way together with New Guinea. Now, the truth is, I think New Guinea has over 900 languages because there are so many isolated tribes in this rather ferocious mountain jungle setting. Just incredible to think about what this life might be like. But what is a cargo cult? A cargo cult is something that I started as the more I knew about World War II. I'd heard the phrase cargo cult since I was a kid. I never quite knew what's cargo. Well, cargo stuff, you have freight, you have cargo. You put the cargo in the freight truck and it drives away, or train, and you take the cargo away. That's all I knew about cargo. Well, cargo cults are a religious system of reinterpretation. In fact, the cargo cult is a kind of proto-postmodern religion. Each little cargo cult lives with a slightly different interpretation of technological modernity. So there is, for instance, the Prince Philip cult, which worships the still alive, aging Prince Philip of Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth II's husband. There's also a very interesting cult called the John From cult, which was probably started when someone from one of these Melanesian tribes in Vanuatu met a black man from the U.S. Army who was there probably clearing a runway. And when they asked him, who he was or something, he said something like, I'm John from Chicago or John from Memphis. Said something like that. But they just heard John From. And in fact, let's look at these cults for a minute, and just a couple clips that'll help you to understand these cults and see what we think about them.
During World War II, American troops created air bases on remote Pacific islands. To natives who had never witnessed advanced technology, the sight of giant metal birds touching down looked to them as if the gods themselves had turned the Earth into a planetary pit stop.
They would see these big planes land, and it was all technology that just was out of the sky. They didn't know how these things worked, but they could see them land. And what they liked about it was they were getting free stuff. They were getting cargo. Suddenly, when the war was over, all these airstrips were abandoned and everyone left. And the islanders scratched their heads and they all said to themselves, wow, wasn't it great when all these planes came out of the sky and gave us free cans of corned beef and stuff? We really liked that cargo. Entire religions sprung up from this, where priests actually said, yes, that was our dead ancestors sending us cargo. So what they did then was they began going to the old airstrips and they would build mock wooden airplanes to try and get those planes to come back from the sky and deliver the cans of corned beef to them again.
on this Chief Isaac, and he explains how in the 1940s, a god appeared on Tanna in the form of an American soldier named John Frum. The god told them that if they rejected Christian missionaries and stayed true to old customs, they would be rewarded with boatloads of American cargo. Well, then came World War II, and boatloads of American cargo. Prophecy fulfilled, they thought. And to this day, the U.S. flag is a religious symbol for this so-called cargo cult.
So the volcano speaks to you?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Wow. You have to be ready.
And they believe John Frum lives inside the volcano with their ancestors. In fact, Chief Isaac warns that if our hearts are not pure, climbing the volcano could bring danger and pain. Well, here goes nothing.
Now, one of the big mistakes people make when they think about these cargo cults is that they are these quaint little tribal misinterpretations of technological facts in order to get material possessions. I'm going to quote a little bit from Richard Feynman, the great physicist, and he talks about cargo cult science. We'll get to that in a moment. But even his interpretation, or if you go to Wikipedia, their interpretation is that it's essentially this setting up of a system in order to get material goods. This is not right, because they don't realize that there's actually something quite deep philosophically and religiously going on here. This is a typical Western interpretation seen through our very materialistic lens. We see people building runways, painting Red Cross symbols, venerating pictures of Prince Philip or the American flag. And we see the simple desire to get more cargo. You see, what happened was after that guy John Frum or whoever came, they build a runway, they'd put in a tower, they'd use some kind of device on their head like a radio that created radio signals and such, and the locals would look at this and then see the planes arrive from the sky, from the heavens, drop down, open up, and disgorge all this material for war. But not only material for war, the Americans, of course, brought stuff for the locals. So they brought food for them, and they brought Red Cross supplies. They helped them with their sicknesses. They brought some form of civilization, except basically what's happening is the mid-20th century is going to what is literally a Stone Age tribe and going, bow. And you know what? They kind of didn't see the same thing that the Americans saw. They saw something radically different. What they saw is that, in some sense, these Westerners had somehow placed themselves between the spirits of their ancestors and them. So somehow the spirits of the ancestors were using them to bring the cargo. And then one day the war ends, and the foreigners go poof and disappear. And there's no more cargo. And what are you to make of this? Well, the point is to try to find a way to get back into favor with the spirits of the ancestors. So all of these things that are done in the name of the cargo cult is the cargo is this mystical word, you see, that starts to develop to get the things from the ancestors. So it's not really just that you're getting stuff, physical stuff from the ancestors, but you're getting the blessing from the ancestors. You're getting your sense of identity from the ancestors. And the Westerners showing up, the Australians and the Americans and the British and the Japanese in certain places, were seen somehow as interfering with the identity of these people. It's also a millenarian religious system combining essentially a Christian aesthetic, a Christian story of the second coming of Christ with ancient animism. That is to say, many of these tribes may have had some smaller, I know this is true in the New Hebrides, less true in certain mountain cultures of New Guinea, but they may have had some contact with Christian missionaries who told them the story of Christ. So they would look at these things and say, if we give up our, in a sense, they saw this as much like the buffalo dance among the Native Americans, kind of a chance to get back in the good graces with the spirits, under the not so mistaken notion that they were no longer in connection with them because of this other huge thing which had shown up. Interestingly enough, the missionaries or the government officials who did eventually, show up in all these places, would then come and tell them, you see this object, this totem object, this fetish object that you use in religious ways, that's probably not a good thing. Especially if you're to be a Christian, you can't worship these little idols that you've carved. So these idols were taken away. David Rockefeller took a few away, or at least shipped a bunch. I've seen them in New York City. Really fascinating. These death totems with extraordinarily intricately carved phallic symbols on them and such. I can see where the missionaries would go like, this could be problematic. So they take them away. And then what happens? Well, there's a story that's really fascinating of one of these tribal folks being taken to Sydney, Australia. And in Sydney, of course, they have beautiful museums, and he's taken to a museum, and the person taken to the museum, without really thinking about it, takes them to a place where they have the objects that have been collected, because, of course, in the West, we're no longer so afraid of any sort of demonic content from these objects, so we put them in museums and have people come look at them. And the tribal person comes in and looks, and he sees all these people walking reverently past the forbidden objects in a museum. And then they realize, he says, and he took this message back to the tribe, he says, they have our elders, they have the spirits of our elders, they have the spirits of our ancestors, they have trapped them, and they worship them now. And we have to do something to redress the balance. Interestingly enough, there was a really fascinating documentary that came out in the late 80s called Cannibal Tours, and it was about the first tours to New Guinea, and you see these crazy things. I mean, it's a great documentary. Really, you can find a kind of corroded version of it on YouTube. It's worth looking at. And they show you the relationship of these tourists, a lot of Italians and Germans and a few Americans, and they're coming, and, the Germans are like, yes, could you pose with that? Like, you're going to kill me, you used to be a cannibal, act like you're going to kill me and make a great photo. Or they've come up to people have carved some object, and the tourist comes up and makes some sort of negotiation for the object. Now, what's funny is they also translate the words of the tribal folks on these islands. And one of the things, this person's trying to get the price down. And one of the tribal people, the woman turns to another tribal woman and says, I don't know why they say this is such a good thing for us, because I spent 6 months working on this, and he wants it for a bit. Basically, he wants it for a couple of dollars. And that's tourism. It's another subject, very fascinating. And tourism is much more complicated than people just going and visiting other countries. a strange exchange of realities that, ours and theirs. But the tourist visiting is even seen as being somehow connected to the ancestor. There's a very interesting clip from Cannibal Tours here. And it's not necessarily in a good way.
Mi play no picking ni mark da jera tok ngot papa mama start time European man come up nu para turu mjamanika na oli lukim oli kama ntavla chip la wara speaking na okuto oli kirap ne tok oli ndai bro mi play come back now oli no sabe lo play European man am now oli kirap nungu na oli tok oli ndai man bro mi play come back all right well sempre ira no sempre go se lukim chip long oli kamera wona sempre nya oli kari mi kam Wapre sempre kari mi kame mira no wara ya changwa impi oli koli mon pra tumpuna changwa impi pupuk tumpuna ya oli saya koli molsa na oli sempre karai na toka oli ndai mani comeback na oli karai na board oli papa na mama oli tumpuna tap people I'm now mi pla kisim da jara tok na mi pla institution mi pla ja mark nothing tok oli ndai mani
So cargo cult began to take on implications beyond simply what had happened in Melanesia and in New Guinea. Richard Feynman, the great physicist, Nobel Prize winner, came up with a concept called cargo cult science. And I'm going to let unfortunately, he gave this amazing speech in the 1960s, and there is no recording of him giving it, but there is a man who graciously chose to read Feynman's work, and I'm going to let you hear that being read.
So we really ought to look into theories that don't work, and science that isn't science. I think the educational and psychological studies I mentioned are examples of what I would like to call cargo cult science. In the South Seas, there is a cargo cult of people. During the war, they saw airplanes land with lots of good materials, and they want the same thing to happen now. So they've arranged to imitate things like runways, to put fires along the sides of the runways, to make a wooden hut for a man to sit in with 2 wooden pieces on his head like headphones, and bars of bamboo sticking out like antennas. He's the controller, and they wait for the airplanes to land. They're doing everything right. The form is perfect. It looks exactly the way it looked before. But it doesn't work. No airplanes land. So I call these things cargo cult science because they follow all the apparent precepts and forms of scientific investigation. But they're missing something essential because the planes don't land. Now it behooves me, of course, to tell you what they're missing. But it would be just about as difficult to explain to the South Sea Islanders how they have to arrange things so that they get some wealth in their system. It is not something simple like telling them how to improve the shapes of their earphones. But there is one feature I notice that is generally missing in cargo cult science. That is the idea that we all hope you have learned in studying science in school. We never explicitly say what this is, but just hope that you catch on by all the examples of scientific investigation. It is interesting, therefore, to bring it out now and speak of it explicitly. It's a kind of scientific integrity, a principle of scientific thought that corresponds to a kind of utter honesty, a kind of leaning over backwards. For example, if you're doing an experiment, You should report everything that you think might make it invalid, not only what you think is right about it. Other causes that could possibly explain your results, and things you thought of that you've eliminated by some other experiment, and how they work to make sure the other fellow can tell they've been eliminated. Details that could throw doubt on your interpretation must be given if you know them. You must do the best you can, if you know anything at all wrong, or possibly wrong, to explain it. If you make a theory, for example, and advertise it or put it out, then you must also put down all the facts that disagree with it, as well as those that agree with it. There is a more subtle problem. When you have put a lot of ideas together to make an elaborate theory, you want to make sure, when explaining what it fits, that those things it fits are not just the things that gave you the idea for the theory, but that the finished theory makes something else come out right, in addition. In summary, the idea is to try to give all of the information to help others to judge the value of your contribution, not just the information that leads to judgment in one particular direction or another. The easiest way to explain this idea is to contrast it, for example, with advertising. Last night I heard the Wesson oil doesn't soak through food. Well, that's true. It's not dishonest. But the thing I'm talking about is not just a matter of not being dishonest. It's a matter of scientific integrity, which is another level. The fact that should be added to that advertising statement is that no oil soak through food if operated at a certain temperature. If operated at another temperature, they all will, including Wesson oil. So it's the implication which has been conveyed, not the fact, which is true. And the difference is what we have to deal with.
So essentially what Feynman is saying is there's a kind of science and a popularization of science where it isn't exactly science. It's done like science to produce a result. There are many, many aspects of this. It's this strange pseudosciences. And often these strange pseudosciences have lots of people who popularly believe these things are true. I mean, you can think in the 1990s, the famous Newsweek cover, is this child gay? Talking essentially about them possibly having found the absolute proof that a person is born homosexual. Well, nothing of the sort was ever proved, but in the popular imagination, it was something that people needed to prove, so they simply used science to prove it. Let's consider a couple of recent subjects that seem to breed pseudoscience. First, climate change is a minefield. And it's a minefield on both sides of the equation. Anyone who says, they proved all of this, or they haven't proved any of that, you don't understand. Science isn't there to take a political side. And as soon as you see scientists using their science to take a political side, you can pretty much say, I'm going to distrust that scientist. Because science cannot prove politics. It cannot say, it can say, these things are what we see. But even in the case of climate change, it gets really, really complex.
According to Climate Feedback, a site where scientists rate the accuracy of articles from mainstream media, approximately one big fake news story is shared widely every month. What makes it most confusing is that the usual suspects are not always the worst, and vice versa. Let me explain. One of the most shared articles on social media was published by a Fox News affiliated station and is actually highly accurate. The year before that, however, National Geographic came under fire for sharing this video of a polar bear with the headline, "This is what climate change looks like." Experts later explained it could have been dying from starvation due to sickness or even old age. Feeling lost? Well, you're not alone. And just to make things a little more complicated, during Facebook's recent 10-year challenge, it was those calling for more action on climate change who got a little fuzzy with the facts.
It was a user in Canada who shared a photo of a glacier supposed to be taken 10 years apart. In the first photo, we see a glacier from 2008 that looks very imposing. And in the second photo, taken 10 years later, we see the same glacier which has melted. But in fact, these photos have absolutely nothing to do with each other. The first one was taken in Antarctica and the second in the Arctic. It's not at all the same glacier. It gives climate skeptics material to say, look, they have to use photos that are not at all related. Maybe what that means is climate change doesn't exist at all.
So what can you do to protect yourself against fake news?
Hundreds of world leaders and climate change experts are descending on Copenhagen to try to come up with a new pact to slow global warming. And thousands of protesters across Europe today were trying to send them a message. It's time to stop talking and make a deal. But reaching that deal has now been complicated by what's being called ClimateGate, a string of hacked private emails between global climate change scientists in the U.S. and Europe, which have cast doubts on the very science this summit is based on. The emails seem to show that some of the world's top experts decided to exclude or manipulate some research that didn't help prove global warming exists. 1998 was the hottest year since record-keeping began, but the temperature went down the next year, and it's only spiked a couple of times since. An email from 1999 shows scientists worked hard to demonstrate an upward trend. They talk of using a trick to hide the decline in global temperatures. It worked like this. When temperature readings gathered from studying tree rings showed what looked like a decline in temperatures from the 1980s to the present, the scientists added in measurements taken later by more modern instruments, which gave them the answer they wanted. The scientists say the emails are being misinterpreted.
A lot of charges have been made that I think are quite unjustified, cherry-picking information and not of taking it quite out of context and misrepresenting what it's actually saying.
And then there's the current trans argument against biological sex. I'll let this person explain.
And tell me, what good does dividing people based on their chromosomes do? If chromosomes don't determine your hormones, secondary sex characteristics, genitals, or gonads, what purpose do they serve in differentiating people? The answer is, they serve no purpose. There's no reason to divide XX people and XY people. That is an arbitrary distinction that has no effect on how the person looks or behaves or navigates the world.
Now, this is a dogmatic assertion about science that has no serious research behind it. And this is a danger. We've entered this zone where science is being used as a political weapon. When science is used as a political weapon, it is no longer science, period. I'll let Richard Feynman summarize his case.
Because of the success of science, there is a kind of, I think, a kind of pseudoscience that, social science is an example of a science which is not a science. They don't do scientific, they follow the forms. You gather data, you do so and so forth, but they don't get any laws. They haven't found anything. They haven't gone anywhere yet. Maybe someday they will, but it's not very well developed. But what happens is, at an even more mundane level, we get experts on everything. It sounds like they're sort of scientific expert. They're not scientific. They sit at a typewriter and they make up something like, food grown with fertilizer that's organic is better for you than food grown with fertilizer that's inorganic. May be true, may not be true, but it hasn't been demonstrated one way or the other. But they'll sit there on the typewriter and make up all this stuff as if it's science, and they become an expert on foods, organic foods, and so on. There's all kinds of myths and pseudoscience all over the place. Now, I might be quite wrong. Maybe they do know all this thing. But I don't think I know. See, I have the advantage of having found out how hard it is to get to really know something, how careful you have to be about checking the experiments, how easy it is to make mistakes and fool yourself. I know what it means to know something. And therefore, I see how they get their information. And I can't believe that they know it. They haven't done the work necessary, haven't done the checks necessary, haven't done the care necessary. I have a great suspicion that they don't know that this stuff is, and they're intimidating people. I think so. I don't know the world. That's what I think.
So, we live in an age when people have become inundated with cargo cult fixations. Much of the science that people rely on, most of what you read popularly about science in magazines or what you see on, the National Geographic Channel or stuff, you really have to take that with a large block of salt.
If you build it, he will come.
So you want to understand where the cargo cults are. It comes to that expression which in Field of Dreams was, if you build it, he will come. So you could say, if you build it, they will come. If you build it, X will happen. If I build the runway and put the little bamboo tower over here and make up my own little headset and paint a red cross on top of a building, the cargo will return. So, two things have occurred to me. When we look around, we see something cultish is happening in our world. And I'm not just talking politics here. I'm talking a wide array of cultural institutions. Something is happening. And I'm not just talking about political correctness. It's something much deeper than that. It's not on the model of the traditional dangerous cult. It's not Jim Jones. It's not L. Ron Hubbard. It's not Charles Manson. So here's a question that came to me. Where do we see aspects of this cargo cult mentality in our technological societies? For years, I've thought about what comes after postmodernism. I looked at postmodernism much in the way that art historians look at post-impressionism. People like Van Gogh, Cezanne, those folks. They're not quite impressionists yet. I mean, expressionists yet. But they're not impressionists anymore either. And postmodernism to me is a lot like that. It's not any sort of, I mean, a lot of people are saying, yeah, yes, our postmodern meta-narrative suspicion this is not the end of the road, philosophically. This is just a kind of a muddled waypoint. Because I don't think the whole suspicion of meta-narrative is entirely warranted. I mean, some of it is. There's a lot of interpretations. But as Jordan Peterson said, there are very few interpretations that are actually valid when it comes to living in this life. So I've looked around at the cultural creations of our age. And there's always one principle. The thing that you aren't noticing, which is going to grow, is already there. That is to say, what follows postmodernism isn't something that's going to suddenly just pop into existence one day. It's already here. And it's my contention that we see it very clearly already. And I don't just mean the politically correct totalitarianism that's brewing, or its counterpart in the right, the conspiracy theory kind of fanaticism and such, or conspiracy theory, smackdown, you might call it. People who are just like, I can't deal with that. Those folks, which is its own kind of problem, and there's a lot of guns behind that problem. But so what is it? What is it that's growing inside of us that hasn't been noticed because it doesn't seem very important, because that's where it is. Let's consider the history of art since the Middle Ages. Maybe we can get a clue. Here's a little something that I made for you. I already put a little clip of this out there. But I put the clip out there to get you already thinking about what's going on. So, a mini history of art since the Middle Ages. History of Western art since the Middle Ages. And let's go. Take it away. So what did we just see? Well, we saw a progression going from the abstract, highly symbolic art of the Middle Ages, Christian art, to the more modern, secular art, and then into modern art with its desire to pick apart the pieces and pull them aside and look at things from every possible angle, which eventually ends with there being, once you pull everything apart, then the postmodernists in art come along and start making ironic commentaries on all these things. And this is before the theories ever showed up. But then there's a separate strain you may have noticed. Coming from the world of illustration and animation, something new arises. It is the cute thing, this big-eyed creature. And I'm sure there are people watching this right now going like, what's the big deal about that? Why do you care about, anime and Mickey Mouse and, snowmen and, all these cute, fluffy things? Why? It's because what you don't realize is that this whole cute phenomena, it's the first time in history it ever happened. And I mean that. It never happened before. If you think that 100 years ago there were tons of big-eyed creatures, I can tell you, this is 2020, in 1920, there were almost no big-eyed creatures that I can find. No, what we would call cute creatures, cute images, cute animals. This is something new. Even Mickey Mouse in the late 1920s looked more like a rodent than the cute, fuzzy creature he became by the end of the 1930s. So, now what I don't want to do is spend too much time discussing the nature of the cute, because I think that that's a huge discussion, and I will be having it at some point. But I just want to point to the fact that this thing is new. It never showed up in history before the present. The important thing about cute, for us though, is that it is, you could define it as baby-like. The big eyes, the round heads, things like that. And the thing about baby-like is that it brooks no opposition. Because if you criticize a cute thing, you are essentially criticizing babies, it seems. And so who would want to be the monster who would want to criticize babies? I will. And not babies, but cute baby-like things. In fact, 100 years ago, even the toys didn't look like that. There's a certain thing that has happened. Age appropriateness, except the problem is age appropriateness has long ago jumped out of the little paddy wagon. It's jumped out of the stroller. It's jumped out of the crib and moved to larger culture in general. One of the great mistakes that we have made over the years is that there's a certain contingent of people who have said absolutely crazy assertions that everything will make you crazy. That movies, music, video games will make you, for instance, more violent, more sexual. On the other hand, there are people who have said just the opposite, that movies, music, comic books, etc. have no real effect upon us. And yet, that second, both of those are misunderstandings, but that second reaction, that they have no effect on us, is based on a fundamental misunderstanding, that somehow these things influence your actual behavior in some sort of direct cause and effect way. So, someone accused Alfred Hitchcock's movie Psycho of inspiring a murderer.
When Psycho was made, a man was arrested for murder in Los Angeles, and he had confessed to killing 3 women. The last murder he committed, he said, was influenced by the fact that he had just seen Psycho. So naturally the newspapers got onto me and asked for my comment. And I said, what film did he see when he murdered the second woman? And am I to assume that when he murdered the first woman, he had just finished drinking a glass of milk?
In other words, seeing a movie does not provoke a certain kind of reaction. Now, there are crazy people who will take these things, but that's not the point. So, two ways to consider this. Consider Japan. Japan has some of the most bizarre movie imagery in history. Sexual and violent. Extreme. And Japan is one of the most peaceful places on earth. People don't go watch this stuff and then go out and slaughter people in the streets. They don't go out and have orgies on rooftops. It's not Japan. So one of the theories has been that the Japanese people, in using this stuff, have essentially used it in a cathartic manner to, in a sense, purge the ideas rather than act upon them. And maybe the reason they went kind of nuts during World War II and in the period before that is because these things were suppressed. Now, that's a theory. I don't think I would give you a whole lot of money for it, but there it is. In my own case, I have seen extremely violent, extremely sexual, extremely dark films. I am none of those things. That is to say, no one has anything to fear from me because I'm not a violent person. I'm not that kind of person. So it's wrong to think that these, if you see violence in a video game, you're immediately going to be violent. However, once you've acknowledged that, then there's a much, much bigger problem. A lot of, for instance, people respond about violent imagery or sexual imagery or whatever. And they say, particularly this was, because I don't think it is anymore, but it was a liberal left-wing counter-response. And it was just essentially change the channel. You can just turn it off. But this is fundamentally flawed. And the reason I think so is because, of course, these things affect us. Just look at the lives of people who consume various media. Heavy metalers look like they listen to heavy metal. This was especially true in the 80s and 90s and early aughts. That is to say, punk rockers look like they consume punk rock records. They've changed their appearance. I mean, even to this day, if I see someone with kind of washed out green or blue hair, I immediately go like, yeah, they've been consuming some kind of media. Maybe they went and saw blue as the warmest color, or maybe whatever. They don't look like someone who just simply is going to a church. They obviously have a different philosophy. There is some correlation between the media consume and who we are. So people were looking for signs of violence. People were looking for signs of, real problems. Although now what's happening on the left is you're seeing people start, I can see the history of rock and roll is going to disappear from the books because as the more and more the new intersectional mentality takes over education, the more they're going to look at all those songs about 16-year-olds in the 1950s. They're going to look at groups like the Rolling Stones. They're going to look at heavy metal music. They're going to look at punk rock, and they're going to say, this stuff is canceled. This is wrong. This had a big effect. But I think the problem is that we were looking for the wrong evidence for the wrong problem. If we find ourselves surrounded by strange, cute imagery, then if it has an impact, we ought to see the evidence of what it does. So we do find ourselves surrounded by strange, cute, ironic, postmodern imagery. And guess what? We see endless evidence that it has affected us far more than we ever imagined. So what I'm not saying, don't misunderstand me, that if you see a Japanese anime or you watch a Mickey Mouse cartoon or you do any number of other cutesy things, that you will suddenly be like that person. Or even if you like, the works of some great creator in these fields. If you play video games, it doesn't immediately turn you into this kind of person. However, it all has an effect, and it has been growing surrounding us. Consider the selfie or the TikTok video. My feeling is that the selfie and the TikTok video, among many, many other things, could be the Snapchat, could be the Vine, could be the Instagram post, could be the meme you share on Facebook, whatever. All of this is in the same general category of this weird new cargo cultish stuff. Not all of it cute, but all of it invasive into our thinking in some strange way. What I'm not saying is that people have been acting strangely because they consume cute imagery. The cute imagery is something else. It is our cargo cult. We make it because we believe it will provide us something. It will bring something special to us. But what? Before I answer that question, let's look at more of this strange cargo cult activity. Let's start with collectors. Now, I'm not condemning collectors. I am one myself. And in fact, I am one far more than you are. That is to say, if you have a big music collection, mine is most likely bigger. If you have a big book collection, chances are mine is most likely bigger. If you have a big film collection, chances are mine is most likely bigger. And I'm not patting myself on the back saying, oh, good burn. You have such cool collections, because I don't really care. I don't collect to be cool. And over the years, I've run into collectors who did. That is to say, people, I remember in New York City when I first got there, meeting a guy who only collected Western swing records, which was pretty impressive, I must admit. I mean, this guy had endless quantities of Western swing records, and his specialty was collecting one song, Ragtime Cowboy Joe. And he saw himself in that song. Well, it's a big story. Other people I've met only collect first editions of books. I had a friend who only collected first editions of Stephen King books for a while. He eventually changed and kind of changed his MO. But you know, I was never one of those. I don't care about that. I care about what's inside the book, what's inside the movie, what's inside the music, what it means. So for me, the collection is only about meaning, and it's not about the package. It's not about the edition. It's about the meaning of the thing. But collecting has changed over the years. Let me show you what I mean. If we were to go back to the 1960s, there would be few collectors as we now know them. Collecting as we now know them kind of got started in the 1970s, and even in the 1970s, you could go through used bookstores or find records in, thrift stores that were just absolutely incredible because no one was really hunting them down the way they would, say, by the middle of the 1990s. But by the 1980s, new things were starting to happen. For instance, a collectibles market started to appear, and I'll explain that in a moment. But let's look at some old collectors. Here is a traditional comic book collector in the style of the 1980s.
They're like X-Men issues. They actually hit a point in the 60s where they stopped printing them and they printed reprints for a couple of years. And then they restarted it. That's when they brought in Wolverine. So that's like X-Men 94 and Giant Size X-Men 1. So this is the first appearance of Wolverine, but then this is where he joins the team.
And now let's look at a more modern comic book collector.
I've been collecting comics regularly since 2003, and over the past 15 years, I've accumulated what I think is quite a respectable collection. But the one problem I've always had with collecting comics is space. I'm sure anyone with a big collection of anything has had this issue, but just finding out where to put everything has always been something of a struggle of mine. I'm not talking about trade paperbacks and graphic novels, of course. That's easy, just put them on a bookshelf. No, I'm of course talking about the monthly single issue, the floppies, the ones you get at your local comic book store. They're not really designed to be put on a bookshelf the same you would, say, a normal book. But I've never been quite satisfied with this traditional method of storing comics. Surely there must be a better way to collect comics in 2018 than just sticking them in a long box.
A word about collectibles. Collectibles come when people start making special editions of things to sell to people who think they'll be worth more money. Now, sometimes that is true, but a lot of times it's an artificial scarcity. Comic book industry started doing this, particularly in the early 90s, of just endless different variations on covers. Eventually, the comic book market, the baseball card market, other markets all crashed because of these things. However, collectibles are still out there, whether Beanie Babies or, Barbie dolls or, even antiques and things. People now make imitation antiques because the real thing is so hard to find now. But let's look at record collectors now for a moment. Record collectors are... There was a certain kind of traditional record collector. You could see this if you ever saw the movie High Fidelity, a pretty funny movie. Let's look at a traditional record collector here.
What do you have here that I can look at?
Yeah, good shit. What?
You're telling me there's stuff I can look at? Look.
You can look at this. There's no guarantee I'm selling it to you.
What?
If you're not worthy, you ain't getting it.
It ain't worthy.
No.
We give you thousands of dollars. I'm not worthy.
Well, you're a good customer.
Oh my.
But, I gotta pay with a little blood with you.
Look at this. They take the paint tarp off. Now it's really going to be special over here.
Be careful. They're mint. They're shrink wrapped.
Oh, you don't...
Go easy.
Anybody watching my channel knows I'm very careful.
Be careful.
Sure. Where's the Beatles?
You gotta look.
I need those Blondie albums, 2 of them. I got the cash.
Well, you're the second one to ask.
I got the cash right here.
You're second. If the other guy doesn't come with the money, you get it.
Sinatra. Oh, there's one. I got that already. They're mixed. Okay, there's one. Thank you. I got this one already.
Be careful. I don't want people going through there. I'm just being nice to you.
I appreciate that. As well you should be.
I'm totally serious. I like to process stuff before it goes out. I am not new to this.
Understand all that.
Then let's compare this rather annoying record collector. I know these guys. Like I said, I'm looking for meaning, but these guys are looking for editions. They're looking for that thing that's, the first pressing, the first moment when you could say, oh my God, it has this label on it instead of that one. Which, I must say, as a person who has a lot of records, there's a little part of me that occasionally gets a tingle about that stuff. but it's just accidental. But I'm not one of those. Like I say, to me, it's collecting about the content more than anything. But let's look at young modern record collectors. And notice the girl in the first video calls them vinyls, which is something no one ever called record albums or LPs prior to this, which is actually evidence that there was a complete break with the collectors of the past. It's almost as if she's unaware that anyone ever collected vinyls before. So vinyls was never a word used in record collecting, but it is now because there's a break. And you can just, okay, well, let's just watch the couple of collectors here.
One of the first vinyls I got was 21 Pilots Blurry Face, Gorillaz, Plastic Beach, Lord, Melodrama. Next I have Blur, The Magic Whip. It has a mirror on the vinyl, so that's really cool.
All right, next, Black Moth Super Rainbow, Dandelion Gum. Nice little scratch and sniff bubble here, like the only scratch and sniff record cover that I own. It still smells like bubble gum.
One thing that's changed is that for the older collectors, the hunt for the rare LP was crucial. For the younger collectors, though, it is the display on video which is crucial. The younger collectors would probably describe themselves as geeks or nerds. The older guys would just use the word, and notice I said guys. There are a lot less women collectors in the day. Would probably just use the word collector. And this geeky aspect is what's so important. Likewise, the display in the video. Consider this girl's Funko Pop collection. Funko Pops are these weird little kind of like almost bobble-headed little things. But this girl, I can't do justice to this video because every corner of her room, and it's a pretty large room, is all of these little creatures that are, you could get, I suppose, a Leonardo DiCaprio pop, as she calls it, or you could get one for, Dracula, or you could get one for, she talks about the Pillsbury Doughboy. But the point is, every corner of her room is covered in these things. But what's really fascinating to me, every corner of this room is covered in these things, and they're in their original boxes.
Oh, I love this one. Someone made an exclusive Mankind. Look how cool that is. And someone made a me. A Noelle Foley. So cool. Here's some more pop. Oh, wait, hold up a second. Mr. Pillsbury Doughboy, I love him. Oh, he is so cute. Oh my goodness. Pillsbury Doughboy is definitely one of my new favorite pops.
So here is someone collecting items that are simply cute and collectible. That is to say, they serve no purpose. There is no point to collecting these things except for the fact that they are cute and they are made to be collected. In other words, there's no meaning within the object themselves. They are only collectible because they represent certain properties to the collector. They reflect certain franchise entertainments. And then again, consider how bizarre it is that these little cute model figurines have managed to take everything, including this Leatherface from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and turn it into this. How did this creature that carves you up with a chainsaw become cute? And this is what I mean about the problem of cute. Philosophically, this is a serious problem. It's not a peripheral problem. This is a problem which has invaded the mindset, certainly in America, certainly in North America, certainly in Japan, certainly in Western Europe, certainly in many places. This cutification of things, of reinterpreting everything as something that's just like, well, cute, fun, We encouraged in our society to take anything and make it a collectible as well. and to make the collection not only cool, but cute. Like t-shirts.
Sawadee krap. Wow, you got some cool stuff in here. Yeah?
Consider this. We now live in an age where people think nothing of wearing detailed images and words on their clothing. If you question this, people start to wonder what's wrong with you. And I have received this back. It's kind of like, how dare you ask why we're wearing these things? Why are they so attached to these images? Why do people get things stenciled them on them? Some people go as far as to get tattoos of them, but you can check out my, conceptual humanity video if you want to think about that a little more deeply. I'm not going that direction in this video. Or for that matter, why do people make videos not only reviewing movies, books, comics, and games, which I can understand, but they make them while standing in front of their collections to demonstrate. And what's funny is these collections all scream last 20 years. It's like they scream a certain era. They do not say, I have an old book collection. They do not say, I have lots of old records. Sometimes people stand in front of, all they have is Blu-rays. They seem to own no more DVDs. It's like they just threw them all out, wrong format for collecting and demonstrating and displaying. Another interesting thing is their reaction video. The following is from a video that is somewhat infamous. It is a reaction to a new trailer for the last Star Wars movie, The Rise of Skywalker. And let me just ask this. Why the overwhelming emotion?
Oh, it's gorgeous. Oh, what's right, Kylo? No fucking way.
It is tempting to simply laugh at this video, yet it represents something much more than a meme-worthy clip. This man is clearly having an ecstatic experience. It's a religious experience. It is impossible for him to control his emotions. Again, before I answer this, I want to ask why. I want to get you to think, as we're watching these videos, of people having these emotional experiences that they are sharing through videos. Why are they doing this? Do you think this is anything to do with anything that's ever happened in history before, except as some sort of religious experience? Or consider this reaction video, or rather it's a compilation of videos stitched together. It's from The Walking Dead. It's a moment of high drama in the series. But you can find these for other series as well, Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, and whatnot. And these then are stitched together from individual videos and then put into this patchwork where it really is something like a religious experience. You feel the rise of all these people's emotions as the terrible thing happens. And somehow it's a cathartic moment, but it's also this moment of awe and reverence, really.
Oh my fucking God!
They didn't just fuck Henry after all of that! After all of that development!
At this point, figure out how to build a nuclear bomb and fucking bomb it. Like, fucking,
What we are witnessing is both a mass phenomena and highly isolated events at the same time. All of those people making their videos are making them isolated from each other, just as I am. I am making a video in total isolation. There's no one around me. So I'm alone. And yet it goes out into the mass. And when you make things in a certain way, this mass thing takes on a different, this isolated event takes on a different sort of meaning. Certain television series seem to breed this sort of quasi-communal behavior. And I say quasi because a lot of times it isn't, although there'll be videos of people, whole group of people watching Game of Thrones and reacting at a bar or something like that. And then that's put online. But still, there's this, what Jacques Ellul calls the being alone in the mass. All of these things would fall under the rubric of what we'd call geekdom. Geekdom I consider to be the full panoply of essentially fandoms. And fandoms are, of course, there's a fandom for Game of Thrones and a fandom for Walking Dead and a fandom for baseball cards. But within baseball cards, there's a fandom for the Philadelphia Eagles and a fandom for the New York Giants. And within... or did I get Philadelphia Eagles right? I don't know, because I don't follow it. I know there's the Philadelphia Eagles, but are they baseball or football? I don't actually care. So, but the point is that the geek in our society has become this new central figure. He's moved from the margins, the extreme margins of society, from the periphery into the core of the mainstream, driving the main gears of entertainment. So the San Diego Comic Con, which used to be for comic books originally, obviously, has now become the premier way of previewing and registering the crowd and geek reactions of the folks in the audience, because the large corporations, the filmmakers and book distributors are desperate to know what the geeks think. I will let a self-confessed old school geek explain what being geek used to be like.
That's what used to unite all the geek tribes, was that we had a common enemy. We were marginalized, we were victims, we were minorities, kind of. Now that's gone away. On one hand, that's good, because all the things that we always believed in, that we stuck by, these have now become mainstream. Science fiction's mainstream. Everyone loves it. Everyone goes to the movies to watch the Avengers. Everyone goes to the movies to watch the new Star Trek. Everyone's hyped about the new Star Wars in a way that they just weren't back then.
And here's actor Simon Pegg explaining the virtues of geekdom.
The virtues of being a nerd in the modern world is that we no longer have to hide ourselves. It used to be something... Nerd used to be a very negative epithet, as did geek. And there are probably other ones out there that are still in the negative area. But nerd and geek have kind of become acceptable again now, reclaimed by the people who it's been leveled at as something positive. And it just means that you're into your stuff. It means that you're proud of what you love and you're happy to know a lot about it. Wear a t-shirt with it on, maybe a helmet or some sort of costume. Wear a cape in the street and not be worried what people say. It's just about being enthusiastic and out about it. And so if you are a nerd, you can walk into any comic book shop or toy store and buy action figures when you're over 15, nay older than 40, and it's a great thing. It's a liberation. This is the great liberation of the nerds, and then we're taking over the world.
But then a few years later, Simon Pegg changed his mind. He suddenly looked around and saw essentially the maturity of so many people having been interrupted by this strange behavior. And here are a couple of fanboys trying to make sense of his new skepticism.
Simon Pegg made some remarks pertaining to how us as adults and the modern representation of geek culture is kind of sort of reverting us to a childish mindset. And it was, I think he said it kind of offhand, and I don't, because
well, he did an interview with the Radio Times.
He did, but I'm just saying, I don't think he got a chance to fully explain it at that point. And the thing is, before we get further, Simon Pegg is not a hater of geek culture. No. Simon Pegg is probably the best representation of geek culture because he thinks about this sort of stuff. He does. He's not all gung-ho about it, like the Nerdist or someone like that, which we'll actually touch on in a bit. But so he explained himself further, basically, and Simon Pegg has issues with. So he went on. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, what did he say? In his interview, he said, adults are obviously, they love this stuff. They're taking science fiction seriously, as he does. Genre cinema.
Yes.
He says, part of me looks at society as it is now, just thinks we've been infantile-sized by our tastes. We're essentially all consuming very childish things. Comics, superheroes, adults are watching stuff taken seriously. It's kind of a dumbing down in a way because it's taking our focus away from real-world issues. Films used to be about challenging emotional journeys or moral questions that might make you walk away and reevaluate how you felt about whatever. Now we're walking out of the cinema really not thinking about anything other than the fact that the Hulk just had a fight with the robot.
What it is that's fracturing geek communities and causing problems now is that we have lost that exterior enemy and the enemy is now amongst us.
Uber nerd Robert Crumb, the great underground comic artist whose work eventually inspired what would be called alternative comics, he's much more contemptuous of what's happened. I mean, he's a collector, old school style collector of rare 78s of blues, jazz, and international recordings, as well as, of course, comic book related material, particularly old stuff. But you know, he's gone from being the guy who basically invented a certain school of comic books to being the person who looks with horror at what humanity has become. And what he sees is, if you go out looking for something like 78 RPM records, you're not doing anything that the mainstream is saying, oh yeah, bravo, glad you're looking for that stuff. But if you're buying all the products of the MCU and the Star Wars universe, you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing to keep the economy alive, to keep politics alive. You are a central character in our drama, a central mass character in our drama.
Whole culture is one unified field of bought, sold, market researched everything. You know, it used to be that people fermented their own culture. You know, it took hundreds of years and it evolved over time, and you know, and that's gone in America. People now don't even have any concept that there ever was a culture outside of this thing that's created to make money. Whatever's the biggest, latest thing, they're into it. You know, so you just get disgusted after a while with humanity for not having more kind of like, you know, intellectual curiosity about, you know, what's behind all this jive bullshit. You know?
And then there is the geek, circa early 21st century.
So we all know that being nerdy is cool nowadays. It's great, I love it, but some people are very bitter. They act like life is so much easier now that nerds aren't getting bullied for being nerds. Which is true, but not really. Sure, nerds aren't getting bullied, but it is not easy to be a nerd nowadays. There is just so much stuff you have to do, so much merch to own, so many spoilers to avoid, so many things to watch. It's just exhausting how many hours I need to put into sitting down and watching stuff.
Hi internet, so one thing that I'm really obsessed with at the moment is fan culture, and specifically fandoms on the internet, and what I'd like to talk about today is the idea that you can like something so much that it actually destroys your life. Let me explain. Firstly, the person discovers and enjoys the thing, Then the person goes onto the internet and has fun finding out more about it and people who feel the same way. Person then suddenly becomes aware of their overwhelming perfection and becomes the main reason for being alive. Now, whenever anything happens, they are overcome by so many emotions that they can't function, and it's basically destroyed their life. But what is it that turns you from a person who just likes something into this emotional wreck? It's the internet.
What? No! The Emperor! Skywalker! Oh! Yes! Oh my god! How do they make this more and more epic every time?
One thing is clear. The geeks have gone from collecting to inhabiting the creations, the worlds, the characters that they're obsessed with. Geekdom and fandoms have become, essentially, as I said, they're in the realm of the religious now. Often the deepest emotions people have are now related to their fetishized objects and stories. And unfortunately, I've seen this in people that I know. I've seen them transform from people who had an active concern about a range of life into people whose lives become narrowed down to one kind of game or one kind of movie or one kind of book or something like that. Now, when I use the word fetish, I don't necessarily mean it in a sexual way, although occasionally that is true, but I mean it in the way we talk about, say, African fetish objects. Objects used by witch doctors, objects that have spiritual value attached to them. We can see this in the merchandise, the stuff people buy. Again, t-shirts are crucial here. But so are little plastic figurines, little things you paint, little statuettes and dragons and creatures you paint. Having, I've got Vampirella. Oh, no, I've got Iron Man. I've got like a whole Batman collection of, look at all my Batman models. And I've got more Joker models. They take on this fetish quality in this spiritual, occultic sense of the word. We also see this in completism, that you have to get, a fan becomes obsessed with getting everything. So, God help you if you decide to get every first edition Stephen King book or every edition of Batman going back to the 1930s. You don't have that much money. But, some people are like, I finally got the first edition of Harry Potter. And how many $1,000s did you have to spend to get that? Hopefully you did it 20 years ago. It's just so strange. We also see this in cosplay. People dressing up as their favorite characters, dressing up as versions of their favorite characters. We see this in just the time spent engaged in fandoms. This is an extraordinarily religious activity. In the video games related to, with any given franchise. And the fact that it's a franchise is everything. You see, the modern geek can't exist on 78 RPM records. They can't exist on old books. They have to have stuff they're still being pumped out. They have to live on continual revelations from the prophetic world. We see this especially with things like fan art and fan fiction. Fanfic, as it's called. Fan art is like one word, fan art, and fanfic, But this is not a good place to learn to write. It's not a good place to learn to draw. Why? Because if you make anything that looks like the characters that this little fandom is worshiping, they will be like, oh, I like that. If you don't, they don't want to see the same things they're not looking at, they don't want to see Greek statuettes or you doing your imitation of Jackson Pollock. They're not interested in art. But it is an aesthetic experience, but it's a cultish aesthetic experience. And in fact, fan fiction and fan art are so much so cargo cult activities. Why? Because in order to get a piece of that original franchise entertainment, Harry Potter or the DC Universe. They are making their version of it to keep it alive. Maybe it'll come back. That's the cargo cult mentality. And they're often these are often extremely cultish occupations, complete with factions and heretics. And there's the whole thing of shipping, of people having romantic or, more importantly, sexual relationships. I mean, you don't even want to put the words shipping into various franchise character names and see what you come up with, because people are using these. Again, the word fetish here crosses both lines, spiritual and sexual. But there is no leader in these cults. I mean, even if they're started by a specific person, that person doesn't have the last word. It's not a top-down cult. Consider J.K. Rowling, who is, obviously the person who created the Harry Potter universe. And this word universe, I hate it. I hate it when people talk about the, it started with the DC universe or the MCU universe, Marvel universe, because they were literally huge. But then after a while, people start talking about the Stephen King universe. Or, it's like every little franchise entertainment has its own universe. And I just want to stop talking in this hyperinflated cultish language. Very much the cargo cult language of how we talk about our universe. And if we make our fan fiction, then it will come. We build it, we write it, we draw it, it will come to us. But J.K. Rowling, interesting case. So, many people have said it's a shame she's still alive because she's getting chewed up because she's not in charge of her own cult. And she tried to, in a sense, remain in charge. So people would ask her, well, what about these characters? And she'd go, well, I always felt Dumbledore was gay. And, the people who were woke were like, yes, I knew it. And then she'd start retconning, retconning the universe to fit more gay characters and such. And so after a while, then she started getting more and more pressure from the fans, who really are not someone you want to get pressure from, to, what else? More characters who are LGBTQ, please. And then she finally got pushed to a point because, she actually believes in biological sex, the poor woman. And suddenly she came out and defended someone who basically said, you can do whatever you want as far as an operation goes, but it doesn't actually make you a woman, to which, the trans cargo cult essentially went out of their minds. And so now she has essentially been dismissed from her own cult. I find that fascinating. And people are saying, yes, the books, but not J.K. Rowling. And it's really strange. It would be funny if it wasn't so insane. But what is the cargo that all these people are actually waiting for? What is it that they are making? Why are they making these things? What is it that's happened to the world of fandom and geekdom and collecting? And what is all this cuteness about? What is going on here? Well, there's one word, and as soon as you hear it, you go like, oh, okay, that must be it. The word is identity. People's whole identities are wrapped up in these images and characters. Sherlock Holmes is the first person for whom we have a developed fandom of. But Tolkien, bless his heart, I love Lord of the Rings, I love Tolkien. But even Tolkien was a little dismayed by his own fandom in America.
I knew that I was an Elvican when I first watched the Lord of the Rings movies, as well as read the books as a child.
So it's not enough to simply read Tolkien, Lord of the Rings. You are tempted to become an elf. And I remember the first time, this was before I read Lord of the Rings, and in fact kept me from reading it for a long time. In the 1970s, I met up with some people who were part of the, whatever the Tolkien fan club was called at that time, probably the same thing, whatever it's called now. I paid no attention to it because of this experience. And that is that I was invited to a meeting at the University of California, Sonoma State University in California. And there were about, 10 people there. And they were singing songs based on Tolkien's words. And they were trying to speak Elvish to each other. And you know what? I've been to Children of God camp, hardcore camp. And I have seen some crazy things in the realm of cults. I have had a lot of experience with cults. Very, very few things disturbed me as much as that meeting. Where, this was an early case of the cargo cult of the Tolkien fan club. And fandoms get more and more developed as we go as religious assemblies. Let's consider the strange case of the Furry Fandom.
Hi. I'm Bo, and I'm a fursuit maker in the Furry Fandom, and I'm here to answer questions about the furry community.
So the Furry Fandom essentially starts with people who like funny animal comics. And that's a very specific kind of comic. Think of Scrooge McDuck or Mickey Mouse. Those would be older ones. But they like anthropomorphic animals. Eventually what happens is they start dressing like anthropomorphic animals in costumes. And interestingly enough, all of these costumes are extraordinarily cute.
Is it mostly just like a form of like creative expression, or is there something deeper going on, like with your interest in the
I
costumes?
think it's probably on lines of both, because as much as it is an amazing way to express yourself, people who have issues with mental health find particular comfort in the furry fandom because it's a little bit more, just something's very appealing to it, like the bright colors, the soft fabrics. It's comforting.
What is the Furry Fandom? There's an interesting documentary that just came out. You can find it on YouTube called The Fandom, a furry documentary. And it goes into great detail about the furry fandom, how it started and where it ends up. Let's look at a few clips from that.
We have younger people coming into the fandom, and they see how open everybody is, and they deserve that. They deserve the opportunities that we have or that we didn't have when we were younger.
We can create environments where people are safe, where we don't overreact, where we're not dramatic, and just try to be in the best interest of our attendees overall and let them have the environment they can to be who they want to be.
A lot of the negativity comes from these big voices online, and when you take it into perspective, there's 1,000 other people that are having a good time. I couldn't let it go. I would feel so guilty.
I really feel like I owe a lot to the community just because it's taught me so much. It's made me become much more of an open and understanding person.
And we are, I think, outgrowing those stereotypes. I think we're becoming appreciated for ourselves.
And the main point of the documentary is this. These people have, through the wearing of animal costumes, discovered who they are. It's not shamanism. It's a cargo cult of interpretation. It is a fetishism. And in fact, they spend a certain amount of time in the documentary discussing the furry fandom and sexuality versus the furry fandom and not being sexual. And which is really strange when you consider all these big-eyed animal costumes and sex. But this has become a common thing. You see the same tension in a lot of anime, but also a lot of the new cute stuff includes sex and sometimes violence. But this whole furry fandom thing, this whole cargo cult interpretation, reveals certain things about humanity at this moment. Many people have indeed become the images they are consuming. We are now in a world where even the most frightening images can be deconstructed into cuteness for consumption. And we affix our sights on that star as a potential new form of life. In other words, what's happened is these cute creatures and creations have become, in our cargo cult mentality, this thing that is changing our lives as we surrender to it. And it goes on from there. Consider what's known as otherkin. People who feel that not only are they born maybe the wrong gender, but there are also people who feel they're born the wrong species. And who is to tell them, given our postmodern society, that they're wrong? So kin denotes what they are supposed to be connected to. So wolfkin, catkin, dragonkin. The following individual is not only transgender, but is also a trans species, is a deerkin. And if this seems way too cutesy to be believed, trust me, it's hardly an isolated case. And as we'll see immediately following this, there are people so convinced of their animal identities that they want to become the animal that they feel connected to through body modifications. Now, this is what I spent much more time on in the Conceptual Humanity video and lecture. But in the case of what we're seeing right now is that there are people who literally, what's happened is we've literally gotten to the point where anything you feel yourself to be, you should be. It's like in Rocky Horror Picture Show where Dr. Frank Enfurter, Tim Curry, is floating in a pool singing, "Don't dream it, be it." And this is the postmodern condition.
So in my spare time, I go out to my yard. In my spare time, I go out to my yard and I prance around and I eat grass. And I just watch it because it helps me feel like in tune with my dear self.
All of these things can seem silly or weird or risible, yet don't laugh at them, don't be afraid. This is absolutely serious. Just as the cargo cults in the South Pacifics are serious, so is this. This is not something on the sidelines, this sort of thing. This is, in fact, the central point of what's going on in the larger political arena. Why are people choosing such seemingly random identities? Because in this hypermodern age, we have lost our sense of identity. If people are always talking about identity so much, it's because we have lost it. And so we are talking about it because we no longer have the older sense of self. The old certainties were that we were made in the image of God, and for many people, that has completely faded away by now. Even for many Christians and Jews who do not see any problem with becoming immersed in their fandoms. But that happened a while ago. And then there are the arguments from science or nature, but those also have been torn down by postmodern philosophy, as we saw with the whole trans assertion that biological sex is just a construct. Technology has presented us with a seemingly endless array of stories and images, but intellectual understanding is poo-pooed as boring, or it's put through the Procrustean strainer of critical theory. Thus, if there are indeed no meta-narratives, there's also no baseline definition for what it means to be human. And thus, people can grab onto any image, any seduction, any story that calls to them and confirms to them what they are in their own lostness. And of course, it was only a matter of time before these things would leave the living rooms and playrooms and enter the world of political action.
I'm sick and tired of living in a world where the way people want to express themselves, the way people want to live, makes them treated worse.
Trans rights are for white people. They don't protect trans women of color.
We should have rights. We're human. And we're still going to fight till the end.
Saying that we're all raised to believe that gender is defined by anatomy and chromosomes is not a stereotype. It's a fact about how we are raised. Even if you have liberal parents or teachers who teach you about gender identity, you still come into contact with the idea of biological gender through the media or through interactions with other people. Even if you are raised by open-minded people, you will still be psychologically affected by living in a society built on imperialism, which, by the way, it created cisnormativity and heteronormativity. All white people are racist, all men are misogynistic, all cisgender people are transphobic, all members of a majority are biased against the members of the minority or oppressed group. In fact, most people are racist, misogynistic, transphobic, ableist, etc. I am racist, classist, ableist, and I probably contribute to many other systems of marginalization that I am not aware of.
Bernie, I'm your biggest supporter. Bernie, I'm your biggest supporter, and I'm here to ask you to stop propping up the dairy industry and to stop propping up animal agriculture.
So to see the issues of the day as anything other than identity issues is to miss the point. Poor Bernie Sanders, he still has a fraction of that old left-wing class consciousness left. That support for the workers, that ideology, but the new left doesn't. So the new left is more worried about the suppression of these new identities.
We thank you for honoring us with your presence.
This is as far as Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders got into his Social Security speech at Westlake Park.
Thank you, Seattle, for being one of the most progressive cities in the United States of America.
Moments later, Black Lives Matter activists rushed the stage.
We are trying. We're gonna let you on the mic.
Activists who last year shut down a holiday tree lighting in the same park today prevented the most progressive candidate for president from speaking to thousands of people who came to hear him.
The anti-racist movement, or fourth wave feminism, is it fourth or third? The LGBTQ plus ideologies, and especially the trans rights movement, all have this deep level of identity crisis attached to them.
I need feminism because people still refer to Chelsea Manning with masculine pronouns. She's a woman, goddammit! Stop!
It was a hate crime! You understand what's going on in my mouth? Hate crime!
Oh my god, I'm gonna have so much fun tonight, terrorizing stray people wherever I go.
They're everywhere. Cis people.
Straight guys think they're so manly. Really? Have you taken a dick up your ass? I don't think so. You can't
Roses are red, violets are blue. If you're homophobic.
And when white people say all lives matter, white people are invalidating the lives that have been lost.
Cis people be like, what do you mean you're not a girl? You're wearing makeup.
Just a friendly reminder. Gender, race, sexual orientation, it all coincides at times. Intersectionality, everything.
If you are homophobic, we can't date, be friends, or talk. I hate you. You are what's wrong with this world.
You know, I really wish homophobic people were actually scared of gay people. Because I'd fuck with that phobia so hard.
I went from long brown hair to this. I'm blossoming into a full-grown queer.
Male and female have gone from being the bedrock of humanity to become the most uncertain issue of all. I often think about the sexual revolution, but also the feminist revolution, gay rights revolution of the 60s, and I think to myself, boy, it took us years to get here. This is the result of all of it. It's like, in the end, it's like, kind of like, was I born a deer? How did that happen? The word gender has essentially become absolutely meaningless word. Okay, stop.
Father of 7 who now self-identifies as a 6-year-old girl. What do you think of that?
Man, I think it's interesting.
I've actually never heard of someone identifying as a different age.
I guess I shouldn't, judge, because everybody, has their own, identity and stuff.
How many genders are there?
It's like 5.
How many genders are there?
Man, Shevitz. 1, 2.
As many as want to be defined. I think that gender is fluid, so if you want to use a bathroom because that's a place and that's a space where you feel comfortable and safe in doing so, then I think that that's completely fine.
I think that if whoever you think you are, if you're male or female, then that's the bathroom you should go into.
Whether you identify as male or female and whether your sex at birth is matching to that, you should be able to utilize the resources.
So if I told you that I was a woman, what would your response be?
Good for you. Okay, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
I'd be like, what? Really?
I don't have a problem with it.
I'd ask you how you came to that conclusion.
Oh my god. I feel like a guy for the past 3 days.
Coming into terms with my gender queer identity has been one of the most challenging but also rewarding things that I've done.
In my opinion, gender is a universe.
The word gender has essentially become an absolutely meaningless word, and even biological sex is up for grabs in some quarters. And strangely, people who had formerly been on the cutting edge of societal change are suddenly forced to break with the movements that gave their lives meaning.
I'm not one of them. Hi, I'm Ariel. I'm a lesbian, and I don't think gender is a social construct. I don't think cis straight white men are evil. I don't believe that genital preferences are transphobic or that there are 97 genders. I don't think that male sex offenders belong in women's prisons. I don't think it's normal for people to be praised for walking around with shirts that say kill TERFs. I don't think like these people, and I no longer want to be associated with them. I've reached peak LGBT. This is my coming out video. Never in my life have I been more canceled, tortured, tormented, harassed than by members of my own community. Never have I witnessed literal mentally ill individuals who are latching themselves onto the LGBT community without actually being LGBT for the sake of oppression points, external validation, and sympathy. Never have I seen such disrespect from younger LGBT people to the older lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender advocates who have been paving the way for us for longer than we've all been alive. Never have I seen people that use the word bigot so frequently and not see the hypocrisy and irony in themselves saying it. Some of you have noticed this change coming onto my channel within the past 2 years, as I've gotten what some people would say more conservative. And yeah, I have, haven't I? Since the queer movement right now is obsessed with all these different labels, and I am a fan of labels, I wanted to share a new label of mine with you. I'm coming out. I am officially leaving the left.
Meanwhile, the left isn't the only place where identity has become a serious motivation. There are certainly right-wing identity movements as well. And, in fact, the more straight, white, male, or cis become dividing lines, the more there will be simultaneous developments on the right. This is not a good sign. Consider the rather jokey straight pride parade, which was done essentially as a troll on the politically correct.
I have just arrived in Boston. It's Saturday of Labor Day weekend, and I'm currently on my way to the straight pride parade. the founders of Straight Pride have said they want to celebrate the contributions of straight America and provide a space in which straight people are able to, quote, be themselves and not fear persecution. This has caused a lot of controversy. People like the mayor of Boston coming out, voicing their opposition. I hope it stays peaceful. The city of Boston have said they're going to have a massive police force here. This was something that started a couple months ago online. I think a lot of people thought it was a joke. They thought it wasn't going to happen. They got their permits in time. And yes, in fact, the Straight Pride Parade is actually happening.
In the parade and be embedded.
And like all Pride parades, they even have a Grand Marshal. You guessed it, Milo Yiannopoulos. Yes, he's a gay man, a very controversial gay man. But he was invited to be the Grand Marshal today.
So I've been practicing my straight voice. Did I get it right?
She's wearing a very sparkly Make America Straight Again hat.
I should stay down.
Or the rise of the Proud Boys.
They call themselves Western chauvinists, unapologetic patriots and proponents of Western civilization. Others, like the SPLC, see them as an extremist hate group. So how could any Latino align with a group even only tenuously tied to the racist alt-right? I needed to understand the logic behind this decision, so I embedded with Enrique's chapter for the next few days to learn more about their beliefs and how they identify. Full disclosure, Gavin McInnes, the founder and leader of the Proud Boys up until his resignation in 2018, was also an original founder of Vice Media, but left the company in 2008.
Oh, how sweet. It's not the cops.
Not FBI. Paola.
Enrique.
Nice to meet
Pleasure
you.
to meet you.
Can we come in?
Welcome to the greatest fraternity on earth. Hooroo! Hooroo!
Many organizations and institutions have labeled you all as a hate group or white supremacists. So how does that make you feel?
As you can see, that the white supremacy thing, I don't even have to argue that. Like, 90% of the people sitting in this room are Latin or of Latin descent.
Does that also stem from your family's history with Cuba?
Yes. All those experiences, everybody that's like, yo, we can't even talk against the government. I could never imagine being in prison because you're vocal about your political views.
And I see we're surrounded by Trump posters and Trump hats.
Of the women. Ladies and gentlemen, we are the Florida Proud Boys, and we're here to say, Trump Trump's hot.
And so when we see something like the Women's March to tell Donald Trump, essentially, you're not our president, this is not merely a political parade. It's an identitarian cargo cult build. Build it and she will come demonstration.
Massive crowd of women marching behind me. This is the front line, and they're pretty amped.
Donald Trump has got to go! Hey, hey! We work hard, hard, hard every day to move it forward, and we don't want to go backwards. We're not going to go backwards.
I'm actually not that cold because my anger is keeping me warm.
Donald Trump has got to go! Hey, hey! Oh, oh.
Identitarianism is not about societal dialogue. It is about shutting dialogue down. Since any actual real-world conversations might make the identitarian feel threatened, or in the language of the cargo cult, might invalidate my existence or experience. Let's look at the way the mayor of Minneapolis was treated directly after the Black Lives Matter protests started, after the tragic death of George Floyd. He essentially has told them he cannot do all they ask about abolishing the police. both displeases the crowds and gives away any authority that he had, and is essentially treated like Cersei Lannister in the Game of Thrones. It was in fact ACT UP who first started using this tactic of just shouting shame, shame, shame back in the late 80s, because they felt, there was no discussion to be had. There was only the fact that you are shameful. So there can't be any discussion under those conditions. In the wake of the George Floyd murder, people across the country and ultimately the world protested to bring the issue of police brutality and racism to the front of the conversation. And in some cases, the protests were beautiful and eloquent. Protests were certainly needed to bring attention to the problems of the police in America, but from the first night, something else was also happening, and is still happening in some places. Many of the protests soon developed a fearful aura of hysteria. Buildings were burned down, looting was rampant across the country. Eventually, more than 20 people died in various protests. Many people of color at the hands of protesters, or as protesters blocked the way in public spaces. If you listen to CNN, the Washington Post, NBC, or even the New York Times, you could be forgiven for thinking that all the protests were largely peaceful and that most of the violence was at the hands of the police. But it was fear gripping the media and identitarian agenda which kept them from showing much of what was going on the other side of the fence. That is to say, of showing the hysteria, of showing the darkness. And when you saw people, hands raised, chanting slogans of a perfect new world, you were seeing the creation of a very serious religious phenomena, one that could not be questioned. And the goal is that every person would find their new identity.
About racism, anti-blackness, or violence.
About racism, anti-blackness, or violence.
I will use my voice in the most uplifting way possible.
I will use my voice in the most uplifting way possible.
And do everything in my power to educate my community.
And do everything in my power to educate my community.
I will love my black neighbors the same as my white ones.
I will love my black neighbors the same as my...
I hate to say it, but Black Lives Matter is not the only group that stressed identity. Chief among these new identity groups was Antifa, who made a lot of noise about fighting fascism without, it seems, even a basic historical understanding of what fascism is. And from everything I've read by them, they seemed absolutely marinated in conspiracy theories. They have a conspiracy theory answer for like absolutely everything that happens. And they don't have any single understanding of what historical fascism is, nor do they understand that they are using the tools of fascism to be anti-fascist, or what they call anti-fascist. And of course, there were indeed white identitarian groups more than happy to supply the boogeyman for them. All of this came to a head in Charlottesville. And again, this was another strange affair where if you watch the mainstream media, you got one impression, but if you watch raw footage, you saw something else. Consider this footage where actual white supremacists were met by Antifa, and Antifa immediately starts attacking them. And of course, it all gets crazy, eventually leading into a man who runs into the protesters with his car. And that man was on the right-wing side of the fence. And you know, there's another tragic death. But in the mainstream media account, Antifa was hardly present. There were also people there who were just curious about the event from a right-wing perspective. At that point, what was and wasn't the alt-right was still kind of people, you know, people didn't know what that was yet. It wasn't just, you know, for instance, some of what would later be considered alt-right wasn't alt-right at all. It was just anti-SJW. That is to say, they were just people who were suspicious of the new woke narrative. Well, that doesn't make you alt-right. Alt-right, it turns out, is actually a species of essentially not, it's a lighter grade Nazism, or at least rebranding of Nazism. Well, those things all got mixed up together, and it immediately became clear after that sad event, as so many people on the anti-SJW right, let's call them, or center even, just immediately pulled completely away from anyone saying the more extreme things on the spectrum of the alt-right. But again, the rise of any kind of identity group is a troubling sign. And it doesn't matter if it's left-wing or right. Interestingly enough, the media went crazy because they said Trump was supporting the fascists, whereas the thing Trump said most clearly is that he was against that, but he said there were good people on both sides, meaning there were people there who weren't the Nazis, who were on the right, who were just kind of got sucked into this thinking it was a different kind of event. And that's what I think Trump was trying to say. And interestingly enough, Trump never condemned Antifa, nor did anyone else. And yet, they were obviously just as responsible for creating the environment of violence as anyone else. Had they just left those people alone, we would hardly remember this event today.
USA! 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 Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter! Black Lives Matter!
I am not a big fan of chants to express political opinions, whether it be Black Lives Matter or USA, USA. You cannot discuss anything while people are chanting. It's a bad sign. And when we see the rise of identitarian militias, we are in trouble, especially when they start lining up against each other. The quest for identity is one of the worst symptoms of this age. And without a solid basis for our identities, we are in deep trouble. It is curious to see what happens when someone with a solid sense of identity stands up to the mob. Consider this woman's words.
My point was that black kids in Chicago get killed every single day. Where is the Black Lives Matter in Chicago? Where are they? When black people kill black people, they don't come out and do this crap. The only time they do this crap is when a white person touches them. They're the racists. They are the racists. Because white cops, it's wrong for a white cop to kill a black person, that's for sure. But if it matters, it should matter at all times.
So what are you fighting for? What are you fighting for? You're not here to fight injustice. You're here to cause drama.
A better message would be stop violence. It's not about blacks.
In a unicorn world. That's not a unicorn world.
Period.
Okay, since you're so...
You guys think blacks are oppressed. I am black. I'm not oppressed. I am free.
That's good for you. That's an individual person. What about a systemic issue?
Where? I am black. I've always wanted to be. Like, I do what I want. You have the skills. This is a country where you have the skills. You want to do what you want. You do it. Stop forcing on people to accept that they're oppressed. They are not. I am not oppressed. I am black. Stop making people accept that they're oppressed. You're forcing a rhetoric into your minds, which is not true. That's my point. Violence is wrong, period. It's not about blacks. You agree that whites kill whites too, right? Have you seen any white person coming out and saying white life matter or white thing? No, violence is wrong.
They literally do all the time. Every time there's a Black Lives Matter protest, a white person.
It's not a black problem. It's a violence problem. The blacks kill blacks in black neighborhoods every single day. I've never seen a Black Lives Matter in those neighborhoods. Never. Never. You know what they say?
Or this man trying to prevent the American flag from being burned.
I'm not going to let him come here and burn this flag. Too many people have died protecting this flag.
They died to burn it. They died for the right of this man to burn the flag. Soldiers died for that right. Americans died for the right of free expression.
I understand the right of free expression. But listen, do you guys understand in a communist system there is no freedom of expression? The Constitution is the only reason why you have this right to burn this flag.
And I think he rightly understands that these new protesters are seeing the American flag as some sort of fascist emblem. There's like an old hippie there trying to say, yes, but people died so that we could burn the flag. But what's happened is the flag is now clearly being seen as part of white supremacy, which is an absolutely insane idea. And this young black guy can't go along with it. And interestingly, none of these black folks are seen on mainstream television. You never see on mainstream television. You don't see people like John McWhorter. You don't see any of the intelligent people who are more conservative black people talking on television. It's just, essentially people are afraid to allow those kind of opinions. Now, the only place you will see them is on Fox News, and Fox has its own problems. They will show you all of the destruction and burning of buildings and such without showing you the peaceful protests. They will lionize the police as much as possible without showing you as much of the bad things that police did during the protests. So, propaganda is no good from any perspective. But as far as the mainstream has concluded, all black folks are the same, which is ironically racist. Just as all white folks are the same. We're all supremacist. And in what universe could this sad man in a wheelchair ever be considered a Nazi, since he's exactly the kind of person that they eliminated first? Well, jeepers. That was kind of depressing, wasn't it? Well, we live in a deeply, willfully ignorant time. A time when people are more comfortable with their rage and propaganda and fear. They will live behind their barriers. And this is on all sides of the equation. It's so easy to do that. It's so easy to simply pump up what you believe. Interestingly enough, ideas that weren't even possible for most people 2 months ago, like defund and abolish police departments, are suddenly ideas that people are now treating as if they had always thought these things, which is the mark of effective propaganda. To put in your mind the idea that, oh yeah, I've always been suspicious of the police. Until, of course, you need them. But remember, in the words of Joseph Goebbels, propaganda must always be based on truth. And that is what's happening. I see the most egregious propaganda these days coming from the left, but I see plenty of propaganda coming from the right, and I don't like any of it. We are in perilous times. We are subsumed in leaderless propaganda cults of identity. And this isn't going away anytime soon. The left keeps pushing more and more folks to the right. Consider Ricky Gervais, the British comedian's recent remarks, how essentially, like, if you're now in the center, the media considers you to be a fascist. And that is true. This window has just kept being pushed further and further. So people who used to be in the left, people who were for gay rights, people who were lesbians, people who were libertarians, people who believed in the, legalization of drugs and stuff. Many of these people are being pushed further and further to the right by this new contingent of the intersectionals, shall we call them. We're in perilous times. The left keeps pushing more people to the right in the name of things like perfect justice. Perfection. No such thing exists. And the quest for perfect justice, when people are chanting, no justice, no peace, they don't seem to realize the opposite is the truth. If there is no peace, it means you're in a state of chaos and war and antagonism. And under those conditions, there's no justice either. So that is a pretty spurious phrase. Just as, silence is violence. These are Orwellian propaganda phrases. What about the right? Well, like I say, I see this all the time. Some of the people I follow on YouTube will make a point, somewhat centrist point, and then you scroll down and read their comments, and you just see vitriol coming from, not as strong as the vitriol coming from the left, but certainly vitriol of a sort, or sarcasm, mockery, saying essentially, you don't understand. What? Did this person not fully like Trump? Did this person, if someone questions Trump, that's like an immediate point. People will say, what? Like, it's kind of like, really? Is Trump that great? No. He might be the only person who's keeping this weird sort of thing from shifting all the way to the left. And he's not exactly a super right-wing person himself. What is the right has become much more left-wing than it was 4 years ago. I mean, it's just fascinating. What can be done? Anything. And I think you could say the obvious is treat people like human beings. Don't spread memes. Don't spread these pointed kind of hate articles about how much, how bad Donald Trump is, how bad the right wing is, how bad the left is. If you do spread articles, do things that have thought in them. Memes don't go anywhere but down. They take us all, they drag us all down. What is identity based on? I'm a Christian. So for me, it's easiest. I'm made in the image of God. Does that mean I think God is a big man in the sky with arms and legs? No. I'm not saying God is made in my image. I'm saying we are made in the image of God. And what that means, according to the scriptures, is that it means that we have characteristics that only we share with God, and we don't share it with the rest of the animal kingdom. And that is, to me, evidently true. Now, of course, there will be people who say, oh, well, you're just saying that. You're just a religious bigot or whatever. And I'm just like, God, look around you. What can I tell you? But then if you don't believe in God, that's fine. I mean, it's not fine. We could have a discussion about that. And one of the things that's fascinating is that in this leftist push to purge all the imperfection out, they are pushing more and more people who used to be left-wing to the right, which means what's interesting is once you get, in a sense, on the other side of a certain door, hey, now we can have a great discussion. I'm not like a super right-winger at all either. But, I find, hey, there's more room for discussion in here. And a lot less room over in the left. In the left, if you disagree, you're considered evil. I mean, literally, as far as I can understand, even good friends, if you think Trump is not a fascist, you are evil. Which to me is like the most bizarre thinking imaginable, and it says you know nothing about what fascism is. It means you are historically ignorant. But if you don't believe in God, what have you got to base your identity on? Well, you could do worse than nature. Not that nature can tell you how to live, but one thing nature doesn't do is you don't see anything in nature apart from us trying to become opposite genders, trying to, the world, are trying to become other species. I mean, you do see some parasitic animals that will, wasps that will burrow into certain caterpillars and such like that and lay their eggs. But you do not find the confusion of identity in the natural world that we find in our modern technological world. And so, who was it? Czesław Miłosz, the Polish poet, wrote a little short essay once about his cat and how, watching his cat sitting around and such, he became convinced that the cat has a very, very specific nature. It certainly isn't like a dog. But one thing that he got from that is, if the cat has a nature, is it so hard for us to admit that we have a human nature? Because that's what's at stake in all of this. The cargo cult of identity is not about any sort of traditional identity. It's about this brave new identity, which to me is actually kind of a cowardly identity. I've thought for years, you can either become who you're supposed to become, which in my thinking is who God made you to be, which may not be an easy thing to be, or you can become who you're afraid of becoming, which is what I think a lot of this is, that we're afraid. What does it take to think that you're a tiger? I don't know. But it's certainly not something that, it doesn't make you stronger. It boils you down, but it doesn't build you up. It's not the same as shamanism. It's literally mixing your identity up. Science, again, like nature, science cannot tell you how to do anything. And yet in science, I'm sorry, if someone out there is saying there's scientific evidence that we are not biologically a certain way, just stop listening, because these people don't even understand anything about science. One thing is certain. We cannot base our identities on whatever we imagine, whatever images are crowding into our minds, whatever franchise entertainments we've seen, whatever strange, cute animals we have seen. And finally, I would say this. We have to stop demonizing them, whoever they are. They aren't the problem. We are. We have to learn to talk to people. I've had friends who say, but I just can't talk to them. They're wrong. I can't talk to them. They're evil. You know what? If the most evil person in the world sat across from me right now, I would talk to them. It has nothing to do with... They are still a human being. Their story is worth listening to. They still have things to say. I would be on guard, that's for sure. And I've had my perceptions change as I've talked to people, slowly realizing, ooh, this person is really frightening. But you know what? If you don't talk to people, and I mean really talk to them, and stop shooting missives off and in your social media, learn to talk to people who are different than you and to listen. If you don't, well, you will get what you deserve. Which is to say, if you think perfect justice, perfect identity, if your new identity is worth fighting for, remember, you will take everything down around you in the quest for perfection. And that's what we saw in communism. That's what we saw in fascism, in Nazism. That's what we saw in Maoism. That's what we've seen with dictators, people who wanted to create a perfect world. Okay. I've gone on for far too long. I hope this makes sense. Let me know what you think. If what do you think? Or what do you base your identity upon? So, thanks for watching. If you made it this far, you get points. You're a hero. No, not really. You have to do something truly heroic to be a hero. But in my book, you certainly spent quite a while listening. And if you're not a subscriber, you really should. If you spent this much time, you probably like what I'm saying, or at least are challenged by it. So subscribe. Like this thing, that helps. Share it with someone who's pretty patient, willing to listen to a long discussion. And if you feel like contributing to the cause, which is trying to keep my channel going, I probably need new computers and new cameras. But most importantly, I've got to get my stuff from Alaska to here, and this is going to be an epic thing. It won't happen this year, but I do appreciate all the contributions from people I have gotten thus far. It has been really helpful. I'm not done needing those contributions, so if you feel like contributing, please do. But I am humbled that you would spend this much time with me, so thank you. And from Tbilisi, Georgia, this is Byrne saying, swim against the stream. That's the anadromous life.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.